Our next speaker comes from the Cold Spring Harbor Lab, Sashank Pisupati, who's going to talk about a value-based explanation for lapses in perceptual decisions.
I'd like to thank the organizers first for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to be talking about work I've been doing as a graduate student in the lab of Churchland. So perceptual decisions involve categorizing a perceptual stimulus into one of many categories and then choosing an appropriate course of action. If you plotted the proportion of times a subject chose one of these actions as a function of the stimulus discriminability, you might mostly expect the subject to make errors around the category boundary. These perceptual errors are thought to reflect noise in the sensory observations. However, subjects often also make errors at the asymptotes of this curve, even when the stimulus is very easily discriminable. These kinds of errors are called lapses, and they've been observed across species from humans to rodents. And a lot of people have recognized that these lapses are important to fit accurately to estimate other parameters well. But typically, lapses are treated as a nuisance because they're thought to arise from uninformative processes like errors in motor execution or a lack of attention to the task. Today, I'd like to try to convince you that motor errors and inattention are an inadequate description of these lapses and propose a novel value-based description of them, that is, that they're coming from exploration. And I'll leverage these models to show that you can actually use the lapses to figure out which part of the decision computation brain regions are causal in. So in our lab, we study perceptual decisions in rats. So rats fixate by poking into a center port where they receive a sequence of clicks or flashes or both. And we ask them to discriminate whether the overall rate of the sequence is lower or higher than an arbitrary category boundary of 12.5 hertz. We train the rats to report these decisions by making leftward or rightward actions for which they're rewarded with a small drop of water. And the true power of our task comes from having multiple interleaved stimulus conditions, which can be visual, auditory, or multisensory. And in the multisensory trials, the rates of the visual and the auditory stimulus is matched, so the rats have more information to make their decisions. In order to maximize reward in this task, rats would have to behave like an ideal observer, integrating their visual and auditory observations, and then combining that with any prior knowledge they might have about the task, and then combining this with the learned reward structure of the task in order to pick actions that have the highest expected value. And this kind of ideal observer predicts that they should make fewer perceptual errors on the multisensory trials, and it actually tells us exactly how much improvement we expect on these trials. To account for the possibility of lapses, we can turn to our first model of lapses, which is errors in motor execution. This model predicts a fixed rate of lapses across the 3 different conditions. However, the data doesn't actually match this prediction, as I hope you can see from this average data from 17 rats on the right. On the multisensory trials, not only do the rats have fewer perceptual errors, but they also have fewer lapses, suggesting that these lapses are not arising from some fixed source of error like motor execution. So to explain this, we turn to our second model of lapses, which is inattention, according to which, basically on some fraction of trials, the animal fails to pay attention to the stimulus and just guesses randomly because it doesn't know what the stimulus is. This model could explain this trend in our data by assuming that the animals pay more attention on the multisensory trials, and this could be because they're getting 2 streams of stimuli instead of 1, so it's maybe there's more bottom-up salience and they're just less likely to miss the stimulus. And this can account for the trend in the data, but we really wanted to test this more carefully by manipulating the perceptual information separately from the bottom-up attentional salience. So to do this, we modified our multisensory trials by essentially making the visual stimulus uninformative. So we set the rate of the visual stimulus to be at the category boundary. So these trials are still multisensory, and there's 2 streams of stimuli, and they're also randomly interleaved with the usual multisensory trials. So the animal doesn't know which condition it is in until it actually accumulates the evidence. So both these trials should have similar sort of bottom-up attentional salience, but the neutral trials have less perceptual information in them. What the attention model predicts for these 2 conditions is that the animal should make more perceptual errors on the neutral trials, but should have about the same rate of lapses. But once again, this doesn't actually match the data. This is data, average data from 5 rats. And you can see that, once again, the rats make more perceptual errors on these neutral multisensory trials, but they also have higher lapses. And so this leaves us with a conundrum where these two sort of classic models of lapses are inadequate to explain the trends in our data, and we needed to come up with a new explanation. So what we propose is that lapses can arise from exploration. That is, if the animal doesn't always pick the action with the higher expected value, but occasionally explores the action with the lower expected value, then that would give rise to lapses. And the animal might want to do this if it's uncertain about the expected values. And importantly, an exploratory choice is very different from a motor error because it's directed at gathering information. And so you actually expect the animal to make more exploratory choices when it has greater uncertainty about its expected values. And this is a form of exploration called Thompson sampling, where the more uncertainty you have, the more you explore, and we can capture this with the dynamic softmax decision rule. So this model predicts that the animals should actually be more exploratory on neutral trials and have higher lapses, and this actually captures our data pretty well and much better than the previous two models. But we really wanted to directly test the unique predictions of this model. And one of the key predictions is that the exploratory choices should critically depend on the expected value given the current stimulus. And this actually means that the lapses on low and high rates should separately depend on the left and right rewards. And so what this predicts is that if you change the reward on the right without changing the reward on the left, you should actually change the lapses on the right side without changing the lapses on the other side. And similarly, if you decrease the reward on the right, you should only increase those lapses. And so we tested this by changing the reward magnitude only on the right without changing the reward magnitude on the left, and this is the data that we get from 6 rats. And you can see that the data actually match the predictions of this model pretty well. The manipulation only affects the lapses on the high rates without affecting the lapses on the other side. Another way that we can test this model is by looking at trial history effects. So if the animals were continuing to learn, then successes or failures on the right should only update the action value on the right. And again, that should only affect the lapses on one side. And so this is data from 17 rats again, but split on the basis of whether the previous trial was a success on the right or a failure on the right. And again, you can see that this only affects the lapses on the right, as you would predict from a model, from the exploration model. And both of these pieces of data are further evidence against the inattention model, which predicts that even changing the reward on one side should actually affect both lapses because the animal is just guessing. A nice bonus of the exploration model is that it predicts that these lapses should be differentially affected depending on which stage of the decision you perturb. So if you reduce the value on one side, you should only affect the lapses on one side. But if you, say, affected the prior towards one side, then you should actually affect both lapses. And if you biased the evidence, then you should actually not affect the lapses at all. This suggests that the lapses could actually be informative about which stage of computation a brain region is causal in. So we wanted to use this idea to interpret some inactivation data that was collected by Lital, a graduate student in the lab. So she unilaterally infused mucimol into either the secondary motor cortex or the posterior striatum of rats while they were doing this task, and both these regions have been shown by previous studies to be involved in auditory decisions. And what she found was essentially that when you inactivated the right M2, you only affected the lapses on the left. And this effect, the shape of this effect actually matched what has been previously reported in these auditory trials, but it also generalizes across to visual trials. And in our model, this can be captured by a reduction in the value of the contralateral action as a consequence of the inactivation. And the posterior striatum essentially has the same effect, suggesting to us that both these areas, M2 and posterior striatum, are involved in this last stage of the decision computation, which is computing the expected value of right and left actions depending on the information from the perceptual stimulus. And this is actually consistent with the proposed role of these areas in value-based decisions, where they're known to encode action value. So to summarize, I've shown you today that lapses don't simply reflect motor errors or inattention, but they can actually reflect this dynamic kind of exploration and can reveal value-related computations in the behavior. And I've used this to show that the effect on the lapses suggests that M2 and posterior striatum encode action value even on this perceptual task, and this sort of is a nice reconciliation of the perceptual and value-based roles of these areas. So I'd like to thank Anne Churchland, my PI, and my experimental collaborators Latal and Anup, and the organizers for this opportunity, and all of you for paying attention. Thank you.
Thanks for this very interesting talk. What about thirst? If you brought the animals with different levels of thirst into the experiment, would you be able to predict how they would explore?
So that's an interesting question. The animals actually self-initiate trials here, so when they get satiated, they actually don't do any more trials. We tried looking for effects across the session to see if the lapse rates change across the session. We couldn't actually find any effects from the beginning to the end. The stronger effects are from trial history.
Question over here.
Hi, very interesting talk, thank you. I wanted to ask about Pavlovian misbehavior. So your interpretation is Thompson sampling for the way that value get turned into these lapses. But in fact, you didn't manipulate uncertainty, you manipulated value. And so we know that in many cases when animals know that a value is going to be low, they get irritated and they disengage in various different sorts of ways. So what's the evidence it's really Thompson sampling as opposed to a form of misbehavior?
So you mentioned disengagement. So a disengagement would actually be aborting a trial or not making a choice at all, whereas these are actually choices made to the wrong side.
I think we could consider that to be a sort of
Sure.
disengagement. So the issue is that I think the wider issue is if you think of it in terms of Thompson sampling, you'd like to test the uncertainty effect independently of the value effect. And have you tested that?
We haven't done that, but it would be interesting to see if you make the reward probabilistic, for instance, then does the behavior change in interesting ways. We have done the reversal learning case, and that behavior sort of looks like this, where if you track the behavior over the course of the reversal, you actually see the lapses increasing and then decreasing in the opposite direction. Again, this is consistent with the value, but we haven't explicitly manipulated the uncertainty.
Thank you.
One more here, yeah.
So I was wondering how far do you think these results would generalize? So for example, I guess it's hard to do with animals, but with humans, you could run perceptual decision-making experiments without giving immediate feedback, so just with blocked feedback. In that case, there's no value in lapses because you're not gaining any additional knowledge with exploration. Do you expect that there would be no lapses?
I expect that the lapses might not reflect the same kind of value-related signals for sure, but that's an interesting question.
Thanks. We have one more question, maybe a last one.
Thanks, Sashank. I was wondering, so are these rats fully trained before you're plotting these functions?
So they're trained for a few months, and they basically get really good, and then to get rid of those lapses, it takes a really long time, so their behavior changes very slowly after that point.
Yeah, because I was just curious, like early in learning, what the lapses might mean because presumably after you've learned, then you know that there's this value that's important for the task, right? But early in learning, it might not be the case.
Yeah, so we wanted to see what happens in the first learning part, but we have fewer trials in the earliest learning stage, which is why we did the reversal, so we can actually track what happens when they relearn a contingency. And there you actually see the lapses increasing.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Right.
Again,
Thank you.
Sashank.